Hey guys, I know it's been a little while. I apologize. I have a lot of really interesting ideas for videos. In fact, I've got a really big one coming up that I'll mention at the end of this video. But for today, we're gonna dive right in. I'm not gonna make any more excuses because you know what? I've just been super busy and I'm lazy. Whatever. That was me making more excuses. But anyways, today guys, we're gonna be doing something that I had gotten a few comments on or relating to in the past regarding multitasking on Ryzen. Obviously, with 8 cores and 16 threads, the intended use for Ryzen is not necessarily one sole thing at any given time. With 16 threads to utilize all of those, you're going to be needing to run multiple processes at the same time in order to fully utilize that chip, unless it's some like really specific use case, like a certain rendering program or something like that that can use all threads at the same time, which those cases do exist obviously, but for the average home user, that's not really going to be something that we're all going to be thinking about. Even in my day-to-day work, even just working with Premiere and stuff, I don't typically utilize this chip to its fullest potential. Live streaming is definitely something that benefits from having all those extra cores and all those threads and shit, but that is definitely not 100% something that everyone has to deal with. So today I wanted to sort of throw some tests at it that are a bit more intense in terms of multitasking and whatnot, where I'll basically be running some gaming benchmarks that focus on GPU stressing and CPU stressing, as well as running some pretty heavy processes in the background. Namely, I'll be exporting an Adobe Premiere project at 1080p 60 FPS 30 megabits per second. I'll put a screenshot of the exact export settings in the video, like over my face probably, because goddamn I want to hide this shit. But I'll be running that in the background, as well as some Chrome stuff. I'll be watching like a YouTube video on another monitor, as well as having a bunch of other tabs open, just sort of filling up some RAM and stuff like that. So we'll be stressing it pretty heavily and trying to run games on top of it to see how much of a performance degradation there is to comparing when you're just solely running those benchmarks. Before we get started with that, I'm just going to run through the specs of the system that we are running behind me. It's obviously the build right here. So obviously we'll be running the Ryzen 7 1700. I have that overclocked to 3.8 gigahertz on all 8 cores. That's paired with 32 gigs of DDR4 at 2400 megahertz. Yes, I know if I was running faster memory, I could, perhaps see a pretty decent performance boost, but unfortunately that's just not in my budget right now. I'll also be running that on the Gigabyte Aorus AX370 Gaming 5 motherboard, so that's honestly, I love this board. I haven't had any issues with it outside of having to manually key in my memory speeds so that way I could actually run 4 sticks of memory. That was the only issue I've ever had with this board, and that honestly wasn't even that big of a deal. And then of course for our GPU, we'll be running a GTX 1070. That's of course, pretty standard affair, fucking like 8 gigs of VRAM, all that shit. I think it's overclocked, like when it boosts up, it's around 1923 megahertz on the core and 4000 megahertz on the memory. I believe that's what it was reading out when I was running these benchmarks. That does fluctuate a little bit with temps, but typically it settles in around 1923 on the core clock. Then the operating system and all the programs I'm using are going to be on a 512 gigabyte SSD, and the footage that Premiere is going to be basically exporting is on a 2 terabyte hard drive. So again, perhaps I could speed up the render by putting that on an SSD or something like that. But in the past, when I've tried stuff like that, I haven't noticed that much of a performance difference. And on top of that, that really won't help this specific test. So of course, in order to actually pick out any differences between the two runs, we have to have some baseline numbers. So I'm going to be running the free version of TimeSpy, the free version of Firestrike, and the free version of Superposition, which is the newest benchmark from the guys that made Heaven and all that stuff. The cool thing about the ones from 3D Mark are that they have not only just GPU stressing tests, but also CPU stressing tests, and then combined tests. Especially in Firestrike, they have that one combined test where it stresses both your CPU and your GPU at the same time, so you can kind of see how well they work together and potentially pick out bottlenecks. And then of course, since I am going to be using CUDA acceleration in Adobe Premiere, that will sort of I typically notice that if I'm monitoring GPU usage, that typically when I'm using CUDA acceleration, it only uses 40 to 50% of my GPU power. But of course, since I am using CUDA acceleration, that could impact the performance of the GPU centric tests. And of course, in the background, I'll only be running things like, just like the default stuff that launches up. I have like Steam running in the background, Razer Synapse, little things like that. Typically, if I just have the system idle with all these programs running in the background, the CPU sits around 1% utilization. So the impact of those background programs on these baseline tests are pretty minimal. Now, of course, when I show you the results from these baseline tests, you'll be able to see the presets that I'm using. Obviously, if you're using the free versions of Firestrike and TimeSpy, you'll be able to notice there's really no settings you can adjust. The Firestrike free version runs at 1080p, and I believe the TimeSpy benchmark runs at 1440p in the free version. And beyond that, you really can't change any of the settings, unfortunately. Whereas superposition is obviously fully customizable in the free version, but I'm going to be using the 1080p extreme preset just for consistency and ease of testing for anyone else who perhaps watches this and wants to try these out themselves. So as I mentioned, there's going to be that Adobe Premiere project exporting in the background, as well as a 720p video playing on the other monitor, and then of course a bunch of tabs open to sort of, fill up some RAM, stress the CPU, give it a little bit of shit to do in the background, as well as these benchmarks running on top of it. And we're going to run them all with the exact same settings just to see, how much our numbers change. Obviously, I'm expecting there to be a decrease in performance. Just kidding, I already know there was because I did the tests already. As I expected, and as you probably did as well, in any case, pretty much with any processor, it doesn't matter how powerful it is, the more you have running, the more it's going to impact the other programs that you're trying to use. So obviously, with some pretty heavy background processes running, it did have an impact on the performance of these benchmarks. Now, of course, I honestly feel like a lot of that can be attributed to CUDA acceleration, since the GPU is going to be stressed more when you're using CUDA acceleration. Although honestly, I would argue that using Adobe Premiere without CUDA acceleration is kind of stupid, because it really, really increases your render time significantly, sometimes 4 times that as without using it. That was really fucking poorly worded. Without CUDA acceleration, your renders can sometimes be up to 4 times as long as with. So honestly, if you're not using CUDA acceleration, then you're missing out on a lot of potential performance. So one thing to note is that if I'm monitoring CPU usage with Task Manager, typically when rendering, the CPU usage sits at around 50 to 55%. And then when I have these GPU centric tests running on top of it, since obviously the CPU does have to work a little bit, that typically jumps up to around 60 to 70%. So that's still by no means using the entire, like 100% utilization that the CPU can theoretically have at any given time. But that's of course because a lot of that process is offloaded onto the GPU with CUDA acceleration. Then of course in the CPU tests in Firestrike and TimeSpy, CPU usage spikes up to 100%. It does this even if that is the only program running. There is no way to really go around this, because these tests are specifically designed to stress your entire CPU, and as far as I've ever seen, no matter how many cores you have in a system, they will 100% every single thread on that system, which of course is just kind of a testament to how well optimized they are. And then of course the mixed test in Firestrike is a bit harder on the CPU, sometimes going up to 85-90% CPU usage, which still, isn't 100% like those CPU centric tests. But of course, what does this mean? What am I getting out of this? Well, across the board, the scores dropped, roughly 10, 15, 20%. So I could have just said 10 to 20%, but the more numbers I throw in, the more intelligent I sound. So across the board, it did impact performance, which of course is to be expected. I don't think there's a single processor on the market that could, fully negate any performance impact that having a high quality render running in the background would load onto your system. Especially with Premiere getting more and more well optimized for multi-core usage, where it can actually start evenly distributing its load across all the threads that it has thrown at it. It seems like this is just a growing trend where it's like, okay, Well, you can speed up your renders if you got more cores and shit. More importantly, you can speed up your renders if you've got a good GPU in your system. I have yet to be able to test SLI with CUDA support, so maybe that's something for the future if I suddenly come across $400 to buy another 1070, but that's a sidebar. Aaron, stay on task. Stay on fucking task. Now, the biggest issue that I had throughout this entire test, and again, I keep stressing this, but I feel like it's important to mention, is that CUDA acceleration seems to offload enough of the render process to your GPU that it introduces sort of, I don't want to call it a stutter because the games don't downright freeze for any period of time, but there's random dips in frame rate. So say a game that is averaging 60 FPS in the final results. In reality, what happens is every couple seconds it'll dip down to around 40 FPS. And even though you could argue that 40 FPS is playable at times, these rapid dips and these sort of jumps that it has, despite the game not entirely freezing, make the game feel extremely unstable. So of course this wouldn't be like a big deal in something, say like a 4X strategy game or something single player or whatever. It's definitely noticeable, but the game could still be played, especially since with CUDA acceleration renders complete pretty quickly. So if you're just doing it in the background real quick while you're playing a game or something, it's not that big of a deal. But for games that require more consistent frame rates like online shooters and stuff like that, this could definitely be a game breaker. And that's not to say that Ryzen can't multitask. When I'm doing things that are lighter, that perhaps just use a ton of RAM, or just, you know, you just got a bunch of programs that don't have a ton of CPU usage, or more importantly, don't offload a ton of their process to your GPU running in the background, there is no performance degradation. Especially with something like OBS, where you're, you know, pretty much that solely uses the processor, unless you're using something like NVIDIA's NVENC codec, which don't use that, it looks like garbage. But OBS, which typically just uses the CPU, you typically won't see that much of a performance impact, because even though that is a heavily multi-threaded process where it uses a lot of your processing power, it's solely on the processor. So all of those threads that the Ryzen 7 series have to offer are being utilized, but it's not super stressing your GPU like Adobe Premiere. Now again, that could be something that would be very interesting for me to test in the future. Perhaps testing streaming while running these benchmarks or something like that would be beneficial, since obviously this isn't exactly the most CPU specific test case that I could have used, but it's one that I face pretty frequently and I feel like a lot of people would face as well, so I figured I would give it a go. And it's also a good way to really heavily stress the system, and it does stress the CPU to a pretty significant extent, so it does give you a better idea of how Ryzen handles in heavy use case scenarios, since a lot of people who are buying CPUs of this caliber with 8 cores, even 6 cores or more, are typically using it for more creative means, or they want to do multitasking or streaming. But more specifically, the people who are using it to create things in Adobe Premiere so widespread, it's definitely something to make note of. Anyways, guys, I don't want to drag this on for too long. I just want to mention something that I've got sort of in the works. I just ordered like a part to test, basically. For those of you who don't know about this somehow, who are involved in the tech space, there's a cool thing going around that seems to be catching on with external GPUs on laptops and stuff to sort of boost performance without, you know, having to increase overhead costs when you're buying the laptop itself. So of course by this I mean having a GPU, like a dedicated desktop class GPU, like the one I have right here, and running it outside of the laptop. Like, I have to admit, that's not something I would have thought of even like 3 years ago. It's not something that would have seemed all that practical to me. But of course, typically these things require either proprietary or very expensive connections that only function with very specific laptops. Until now, maybe anyways. We'll have to see. So I ordered a fairly cheap, it was $65 I believe on Amazon, a fairly cheap external graphics card adapter. Basically what it does is it plugs into the like mini PCIe port on laptops basically. So typically this is usually taken up by your LAN card, fucking what? Taken up by your Wi-Fi card. So I'll be popping open my laptop, taking out the Wi-Fi card, just using the wired connection for these tests, and then I'll be slapping this beautiful thing in there. This is a nice old GTX 760, and we'll be seeing how much of a performance impact it has on, like, well, for one, we'll be seeing if it works. Supposedly the one that I bought it's fairly well reviewed. It has the ability to hook up like external power, since obviously this thing requires an 8-pin and a 6-pin adapter. Like this is definitely not the most power efficient card, but I'll be running it with obviously a separate power supply and everything. So we'll be seeing how much performance I can get out of this pretty thing. And, you know, even though perhaps the mini PCI slot might be bottlenecking it, we're going to see how much it's bottlenecking it. I'm going to be running some benchmarks with this card on my system behind me, so there will obviously not be a bottleneck here other than the card itself. I might even test it out with my 1070. If I notice that there's no bottleneck with this card, I'll try and slap in my 1070 in there and seeing how that goes. Since obviously the laptop I'm running has got a quad-core i7 in there with hyperthreading. In theory, in most games, the processor won't be the bottleneck, so we'll have to see how that goes. But hopefully that will be coming out within the next week or two. It really just depends how long it takes for them to ship it to me. If you guys have any other things you want me to test, perhaps it doesn't have to necessarily be Ryzen related, then go ahead and leave those in the comments below. If you have any strong feelings on this video, go ahead and slap the like or dislike button. If you have any input on the tests that I ran here, I know they weren't exactly the most in-depth or balanced tests, but I figured they were accurate to sort of my work case, typically what it is. If you want to see some more in-depth streaming tests like I mentioned previously, then go ahead and let me know in the comments or slap a like on this video. And of course, if you have not subscribed already and you want to see more Ryzen and sort of just tech hardware related stuff, some more relaxed shit, like I kind of just test stuff when I think it's fun, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. I would really appreciate it. There have been a ton of new people flooding in. We're actually fairly far past 1,000 subscribers now, which is really awesome. So thank you to all of you people who are new here. Anyways, guys, thanks so much for watching this video, and I will see you next time.